Sauerkraut is an amazing, easy way of using your excess cabbages that you get on your allotment or garden. Now, we have sowed quite a lot of cabbages for this year, but it's because I want to make regular sauerkrauts and different types of ferments. Now, fermentation isn't as scary as what you think, but there is some rules to it. First off, you want everything as clean as possible. It doesn't have to be sterile, but it does have to be very clean. Fermentation can be anything from a few hours to a few months to even a few years on some recipes. But for this sauerkraut, we're literally going to leave it for a few weeks after we've made it. So it's a perfect way of using some of your excess cabbages, or in this case, cabbages grown for my sauerkrauts. Now, fermentation isn't pickling or anything like that. It's literally fermentation with the use of salt. This salt brine of 2 to 3% is what protects your cabbages from turning bad and maybe making you sick. So you need to make sure that you get this right. One of the first things that we need to do is, one, find a jar big enough to support whatever fermentation that you're going to do. Now, this one has got a lid, but we're not going to be using this for fermentation. But this one's a reasonable size wide jar. Now, in the UK, it's not as easy to get some of the jars as some of our guys in the US. But I find these ones actually not too bad. Now, I think these are half-gallon jars, and I managed to pick these up for a couple of pound each. Then obviously you need your cabbages. Now, your amount of jars or your size of your jars will dictate to how much cabbage you need. Now, believe me, you need a lot of cabbage by the time you're finished with it. So you will need a lot more than what you think to fill a jar. Now, I don't think all this will fill that jar, but that's okay. It doesn't matter, because sauerkraut is something that is open to the air anyway. But you will cover it with a little bit of cloth or something like that, with a tight elastic band to stop any bugs, bad bacteria or anything else getting into that. But we'll get to that a little bit later on. So once you've got your cabbages, you need to clean them up a little bit. You don't want to be adding any leaves or anything else that's actually bad into your ferment. And you want to use as fresh as possible. Now, these are homegrown, so there's a big chance that I'm going to find some nasties in here. But I'm actually going to take off a couple of the outer leaves to use for a bit later on. This will be my cover for the top of my mix. So I'm just going to pop these ones to the side. Now, you want to shred it as thinly as you possibly can. Now, there's different types of cabbage. Now, normally it's the harder white cabbage that you get. But you really can use whatever cabbage you want. You can also add some carrot or any other veg that you want to actually add some extra flavour to your sauerkraut. Now, with this one, I am literally just going to add cabbage. Now, I don't like too much of the big heavy stuff. And as we're chopping, we're just going to pop into some water. Now, these have had a good wash already, but after the first chop, maybe give it another bit of a rinse. Now, we grew these cabbages are either Greyhounds, Golden Acre, or I think it was Best of All. Very quick to grow, and we started these in February. Now, you really do want to get this as fine as you can. Normally I'll use a processor, but because these are homegrown, you really don't know what you're going to find on the inside. Now, I had a lot of slug damage this year in the cabbages. That happened over the last 3-4 weeks. Because the weather's been a lot wetter. Now, none of these extra bits of cabbage is going to go to waste. They'll either go to the chickens, which they love, or the compost bin. But you can also cook them down and maybe make a cabbage-based soup recipe. Majority of the population is so used to having vegetables that have no holes or no issues with them or no pest damage at all, that we're completely separated from the reality of what growing good healthy veg is like. And there's nothing more of a shock than in your first growing season and how much damage you actually see on some of your fruits and vegetables. Doesn't mean it's inedible. Sometimes you just cut around the bad bits and reuse that fruit or vegetable for something else. It's like my tomatoes that maybe have got a few holes in or not so pretty, or it's just starting to go bad. I'll chop them up and use them for jams or sauces. And the fresher your cabbage, the more juice it will release, which is more brine, which is exactly what we want. Now, looking at mine and how much it breaks down, I actually need some more. So I've actually got some leftover red cabbage that needs to be used. So, and I think this will add some beautiful colour to this. Now, all we need to do now, once you've got all your cabbages cut up, is to actually weigh how much all that cabbage is. So that's coming to about 2,000 grams in weight of the actual total cabbage I'm using. So I don't like my sauerkraut too salty, so which is 2%, which is the minimum that you need to make a safe brine. That is 40 grams. Now a lot of people prefer to use the 2.5 or maybe the 3, but I find sometimes the 3 far too salty, and I don't want to have too much excess salt to my diet, and I actually eat this when it's ready by the plateful. I absolutely love it. So 2% for me is more than enough. So once that's weighed out, we just need to weigh out our salt. Now don't use table salt. You need to use either a fine sea salt or a non-iodized sea salt. It's really important that you don't use iodized salt in your pickling or fermentation, because this can have an actual knock-on effect with how your produce actually performs. So we just need 40 grams. Now I'm using a fine sea salt because I find that the fine sea salt works better than any coarse or anything else. But if that's all you've got and you don't want to spend, then use it. It just makes it a little bit harder. Now I don't know whether you're like me and make an unbelievable amount of mess, but I really do. Now I'm going to use an extra bowl too, and actually put some of this cabbage into this bowl so I can actually work it a little bit easier. I like to do it in small amounts because it means you can actually get to everything a lot easier. Now I need to invest in some much bigger bowls. I've got some pickling and some gherkins to make, and I need a much bigger bowl to actually start that off in the brine. Okay, so we're just going to start with a small amount on the bottom. In fact, I'm going to start off with a little bit less than that. And all we're going to do is put a little bit of a salt on a layer. And then with clean hands, you're going to crunch. Now what the salt does, it actually draws out the water and it actually draws out the water content of your ferments, basically, of your cabbages. And already I can actually feel that getting wet. Something very comforting when it comes to getting your hands into something like this. I don't know what it is, but it always makes me smile. Now I was going to layer the red cabbage up and actually do it separately, but I'm actually just going to mix it all in. It still makes a really pretty sauerkraut. Tasty too. Now, because I'm already half full, I'm actually going to get my rolling pin and actually start bashing the cabbage down. Basically, you're trying to break down that cell structure so it produces more liquid. Now, I've added a 2% salt mix, but when I've finished mashing and got all the liquid out that I actually need, I'll actually taste it and see how salty it actually is. And I might add a little tablespoon or a teaspoon extra. I just don't want it too salty. And already you can see a difference in the texture. But we plough on. And you just keep on going until you start getting a liquid form. This is the actual juices that's going to actually brine and help ferment your sauerkraut. Now, once you've mashed and mashed and mashed, you'll have something that resembles this. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of cabbage water in that. And the longer you leave it, the more cabbage water that will come out. But we're going to bottle this straight away, because we're going to do a little bit more mashing as we go along. This bottle has gone through the dishwasher and has had lots of soapy water and washed out. So this is ready to go. And we are just going to pop this in. Now this is where the wide mouth bottles is actually better. But I can't seem to get any that I'm willing to pay the price for. Now I'm going to fill it about quarter the way up, and then I'm going to give it another good bash. We want to cram as much into this jar as possible, making sure that we leave enough space at the top. This also helps produce a little bit more liquid. Now, I forgot I've got a funnel. I'm going to try and use this instead. Yeah, it's much easier. This is just a cheap funnel off Amazon that I got with my canning stuff. Let's give that a little bit of a bash. Now, as you can see, how much cabbage there actually was to how much you get left with. You really do need a little bit more than what you think. All depends on the types of cabbages, water content of the cabbages, all that kind of stuff. Now obviously if you are using glass jars, which you should, because there's less risk of any contamination. On plastic you can actually make scratches and marks on them, which can actually harbour bacteria, and it's not the greatest thing to use in ferments. Glass or porcelain seem to be the best. Now all that juice is just going to go in. And when you're mixing in the bowl originally, it doesn't look like you're going to have enough. But by the time you've finished and bashed that cabbage down, you'll realise how much water is in those cabbages. Now you want to compact this down as much as possible on this final press. You're looking for all the cabbage to be actually under that liquid. It's really important, because that liquid is what stops everything going mouldy and spoiling. You've spent all this time making your sauerkraut. These little bits are actually what makes the big difference to your final product. These cabbage leaves that you kept earlier, These are going to be great for keeping all this loose cabbage below that brine line. And you're just going to pop them in. And you want them up the sides as much as possible, close to the edges as much as possible. Basically, you're using it as a layer to protect your sauerkraut as it ferments. Now, some people use like a cellophane or other bits and pieces, but I don't want to spend any excess money on making something like this. I would just rather use what I can. Now, you don't eat these leaves. These are just a protection barrier. That just so happens to work very well. A lot of people use the weights to keep this sauerkraut down. But I think those glass weights are really, really expensive. Now, these are food safe plastic food bags, and I'm going to use one of these instead. Now, last time I did sauerkraut last year, I had a much wider mouthed jar. So I was actually able to put a saucer on the top with the weight of a mug to actually keep it all down. I actually broke it. So this year, this is what I'm using. And then I'm going to fill that with water. Now just make sure none of that water goes into your brine mixture, because you don't want to dilute any of that mix. And I'm just going to seal it up, taking some of that air out at least. Now, I probably will invest in some weights for the jars, but I want to make sure that the jars I buy, that the weights are actually going to fit into the mouth. You can actually buy fermentation crock pots, but again, it's something you don't see very often in this country, and I will not pay the prices of what some of the stores want. As you can see with this, I've got a nice gap from the top of my cabbage to the actual rim of my jar. This is really important because fermentation is a growing period. So this will start bubbling and all the bacteria, the good bacteria, will start producing in this, and it will actually start bubbling up and out. So it's really important that you keep this jar, one, on a tray, and two, not overly full, because you could end up with a mass of sauerkraut all down the sides of your jars. So make sure you leave a good enough gap. Now this looks good to me. It looks like everything is actually underneath, all the chopped cabbage is underneath this barrier now. And the last thing that you need to do, with a clean tea towel or cloth or anything that's going to protect it from any fruit bacteria or anything, to cover it with a little bit of an elastic band and tie this up. Now, it's important to not put a proper lid on your sauerkraut because it could end up exploding your jar. It releases CO2. This is what the bacteria produces, and it's a byproduct basically. So you really do need to not seal these jars as you are fermenting. Now, this ferment will take between 3 weeks plus. Now, there's lots of people that will say that it needs months or even years to make a really good sauerkraut. I like about the 4-week mark. I find that this is the perfect amount for me personally to actually have a good sauerkraut. Once you've got to that fermentation stage, after trying it in a few weeks' time, I don't normally try it until about the 3.5 to 4 week mark. once it's got to a stage that I actually enjoy eating, it then the bag and the weights get taken off, and then I actually put a lid on and put it into the fridge. Putting it into the fridge will actually stop any excess fermentation from going on, and this is where it is then safe to lid and store properly in a fridge. But if you leave it out on the side for even longer, you have to keep that lid off and keep it covered with some kind of physical barrier that's still going to let the CO2 out and the oxygen in, because the bacteria need this. So I hope this has been a little bit of an information on starting your very first fermentation. There's lots of different ways out there. It's just something important to remember is just remember to use 1, good clean equipment, and 2, the right brining amount for the fruits and the vegetables that you're using. But there is so many ways to ferment and use your fruits and vegetables from your plot. This is just one of the great ways to use some of your white cabbages or red, or in fact lots of other fruits and veggies. So if this has been any help to you at all, why don't you leave a comment below. Let me know how you do it and what kind of length of time that you actually ferment your sauerkraut for. What additional flavours do you add? Is there anything that you like to add for a slightly different flavour to your sauerkraut? There is millions of different ways out there to make sauerkraut, so really you can make it your own. Just let me know in the comments. I love finding new ideas and new ways of using and producing more fruits and vegetables to use within the home. And if this is something that you'd like to see more of, like and subscribe. This really does help the channel, and this will also keep you updated with any new videos or new releases that we do throughout the rest of the year. But I thank you for all the support that you guys have given me up to now. It's been truly amazing. It's just been so quick. It's been so big and so quick. I really am surprised of the amount of support that you guys have given me. So thank you. And I'll see you in the next video.